Vladimir Putin is ready to resort to extreme measures and carry out provocations against NATO in the coming months, and the United States of America has abruptly changed its mind about reducing its army in Europe and, on the contrary, is ready to increase its military presence to protect against the Russians. The intelligence of the United States of America has officially warned Poland that Moscow is planning an armed provocation on Polish territory. By striking the country's strategic facilities with missiles or drones, or by sending Russian soldiers across the border. That is a full-scale intervention. According to sources close to Polish President Karol Nawrocki, the United States of America is warning that Russian aggression could occur within a few months. Therefore, the Americans subtly hinted to Nawrocki that it would be better for him not to quarrel so openly and directly with Volodymyr Zelensky because he might still need his help. However, the head of Poland's foreign intelligence agency stated that Russia is preparing a serious provocation in the Baltic countries and predicted the appearance of little green men there, similar to the annexation of Crimea. Against this backdrop, there was a sharp shift in rhetoric in Washington. The Wall Street Journal writes that U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was planning to make a sensational statement at the June meeting with his NATO colleagues in Brussels that the United States of America is preparing to further reduce its military forces in Europe. But his plans caused sharp dissatisfaction in the White House and even personal disapproval from Donald Trump, as well as criticism from congressmen of both parties. As a result, Pete Hegseth announced only a review that the Pentagon will conduct to determine the optimal composition of the European contingent. My name is Alexei Pecci. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. So, sources from two publications, The Telegraph and Onet, report that Washington has warned Warsaw that Moscow is planning an armed provocation on Polish territory by striking strategic Polish targets with missiles or drones, or even by sending Russian soldiers across the border. According to American intelligence, the goal of such actions could be to test NATO's resolve to defend its territory, as well as to escalate the military situation and force Western allies to suspend their assistance to Ukraine. According to sources close to Polish President Karol Nawrocki, the US has warned that Russian aggression could take place within the next few months. And now, Polish security services believe that Moscow may carry out a drone attack on critical infrastructure, including electricity facilities, or simulate airstrikes that would force Poland to activate its air defense systems. Authorities also do not rule out the scenario of a limited-scale ground invasion by Russian soldiers across the border from Belarus or the Kaliningrad region. And in the most extreme scenario, a hybrid attack could occur in the border region. This was stated by one of the sources in Polish intelligence. Another informed source also reported that an armed incursion into Poland involving Russian or Belarusian soldiers is quite possible. According to the sources, the Kremlin may present its actions as an allegedly unintentional incursion by lost soldiers onto Polish territory due to a GPS malfunction, or as a rescue operation to evacuate a helicopter that had a malfunction and accidentally crashed on Polish territory. And now, sources from the Onet publication say that the Russian Federation is counting on Poland refusing to open fire on Russian soldiers and entering into negotiations with Moscow or Minsk under pressure from the United States. So basically, the idea is to pretend that they got lost, entered by accident, the helicopter crashed, they went on a rescue mission, and supposedly these Russian soldiers are not shooting at Polish soldiers. The Polish also refuse to open fire and sit down at the negotiating table. And so, according to the interlocutors, Russia will consider it a victory if the withdrawal of the participants in the potential invasion from Poland happens as a result of these negotiations, and not because they are forced to do so by military means. In other words, this would show that the Russians can brazenly enter Polish territory, then talk and leave, and basically no one will force them out. At the same time, as sources note, ending Western support for Kyiv in exchange for withdrawing from Polish territory could become one of the Kremlin's main demands in such negotiations. A source close to Nawrocki stated that the US, quote, systematically informs Poland about the constantly emerging Russian plans to strike NATO's eastern flank. And they note that Warsaw does not have a 100% guarantee against this. Another source. A security official from the Baltic states told the Telegraph that such plans are indeed being discussed in Moscow, and after the provocation itself, Russia may claim that it was the work of Ukraine. And this conflict between Poland and Ukraine is now playing perfectly into Moscow's hands because the Polish public can easily believe that Ukraine really staged a military provocation against Poland. And according to Onet sources, Russia has not yet made a final decision on an invasion or a hybrid operation that would not look like a classic war. NATO, for its part, could respond to provocations with strikes on Kaliningrad. And against this backdrop, the head of Poland's foreign intelligence agency, Paweł Szota, stated that Russia might seriously try to test NATO's readiness to confront it somewhere else, meaning not in Poland. In his opinion, considering the full range of threats from the Kremlin, it is necessary to act as if an armed conflict with Russia is a matter of the near future. Quote, the level of Russian aggression is very high, and the risk of military confrontation is quite real. In particular, Szota believes that an armed provocation against one of the Baltic countries is a real possibility. When asked whether Russia could send so-called little green men into Lithuania or Latvia like during the occupation of Crimea in 2014, Szota replied, quote, "Today I do not rule out any scenario. We proceed from the fact that Russian provocations and tests of NATO's strength, which we are already observing, for example in Poland, will certainly continue. The Russians are watching our reaction. At the same time, Polish intelligence believes that Russia can continue the war for several more years. The Kremlin is ready to sacrifice the economy and Russia's development for the sake of continuing the conflict. Vladimir Putin will not give this up, because, especially for the domestic audience, he has to present himself as a winner." And I should note here that this year Moscow started putting pressure on the authorities in Belarus, demanding that they provide a staging ground for opening a second front against Ukraine and for conducting an operation against NATO countries. The Wall Street Journal writes about this, citing former and current Russian and European officials. In the second case, these won't necessarily be open-armed clashes, but rather attacks aimed at testing NATO's defense capabilities or undermining support for Ukraine. For example, launching about 20 drones into Poland from Belarusian territory last year. And here some truly astonishing revelations have emerged. Szota noted that Poland maintains direct communication channels with the Belarusian intelligence services, despite the tense relations between the two countries. Contacts between intelligence officers make it possible to achieve security objectives where diplomacy is powerless, Szota pointed out. Here is his quote, "It is better to meet with representatives of Lukashenko's regime, discuss issues and achieve benefits for Poland than to passively watch as Belarus is absorbed by Russia." And these statements by Szota greatly surprised many people. It turns out that the Poles are directly communicating with Lukashenko's regime and trust its data. And this is happening at a time when the president of Poland, Karol Nawrocki, has finally fallen out with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. It has reached the point where today the Poles openly stated that Poland at the NATO summit in Ankara, which will take place on July 7 and 8, will not take on any financial obligations regarding Ukraine. The Polish Prime Minister noted that Ukraine is at war with Russia, whereas it is Poland, not Ukraine, that bears the main burden of guarding the eastern border of the European Union from threats during peacetime. Therefore, it deserves special treatment. At the NATO summit in Ankara, it will be President Nawrocki who represents Poland. And so Donald Tusk assured that the Polish side will consistently raise the issue of the need for further support for Ukraine in the war with Russia. But there is one caveat, and here is a quote from Donald Tusk. "However, I am asking the entire delegation to exercise caution regarding any statements about new financial support for Ukraine from Poland. But not because I believe that Ukraine does not need financial assistance. I believe that Poland bears extremely large responsibilities for protecting the entire eastern border of the European Union, and everyone should take this into account. Good Polish-Ukrainian relations are in the interest of both countries, but they also require goodwill from Kyiv. It can no longer be the case that only Warsaw will constantly show goodwill. A heated war of emotions between Poles and Ukrainians would be a disaster for both us and them. And besides, Donald Tusk noted that despite the recent disputes, no one should forget about Poland's strategic interests in the war in Ukraine. Here is his quote. "The war is entering a decisive stage. I think no one doubts anymore that it is in our interest for Ukraine not to lose this war, to preserve its independence, and not to fall into the sphere of Russian influence. I urge politicians to act decisively to protect national interests, but not to provoke mutual hostility. In relations with Ukraine, be firm when necessary, effectively protect Polish interests, but do not set people against each other because that will lead to disaster." The United States of America has changed its mind and no longer wants to withdraw its troops from Europe on a large scale, at least not to the extent that some officials in the White House would like. U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was planning to make a sensational statement at the June meeting with his NATO colleagues in Brussels that the United States of America is preparing to further reduce its forces in Europe. Also, the infantry brigade was withdrawn from Romania and the armored brigade rotation was cancelled. This was reported by people familiar with the situation to the Wall Street Journal. But Pete Hegseth's plans caused sharp dissatisfaction in the White House, rejection from Donald Trump, and criticism from congressmen of both parties. As a result, Pete Hegseth only announced a review that the Pentagon will conduct to determine the optimal composition of the European contingent. The plan of Minister Hegseth, as reported by the Wall Street publication, ended up in the hands of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is also Donald Trump's national security advisor. Well, apparently Marco Rubio didn't like such plans, and after that, Pete Hegseth's plan was cancelled. President Donald Trump himself was previously surprised by Pete Hegseth's May decision to suddenly cancel the deployment of the Texas Armored Brigade to Poland as part of the scheduled 9-month review. And, as it became known, Trump personally called Pete Hegseth to ask why he had treated such a valuable ally so badly. I should note here that yes, indeed, Trump personally respects Poland, respects Nawrocki, and believes that Poland is a reliable partner for military cooperation. Well, why is that? Because Poland has actually significantly increased its military spending. Subsequently, Trump announced that he would send 5,000 troops to Poland, although according to American journalists, the additional forces have not yet been deployed. And despite Washington's constant statements that Europe should spend more on its own defense and rely less on the United States of America, the pushback received by Hegseth shows that the American administration has not yet decided at what speed and on what scale to reduce its military presence in Europe, and whether it should be done at all. And now the latest Pentagon initiatives have also emerged, causing concern among both Republicans and Democrats. Congressmen fear that they will cause long-term damage to NATO and prompt Russia to take more aggressive actions against the alliance. Therefore, congressmen included a provision in the military spending bill that prohibits the Pentagon from reducing the number of personnel in Europe below 76,000, without a risk assessment from the Chief of the U.S. European Command and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as without confirmation from the Secretary of Defense himself. In short, Pete Hegseth really got screwed over. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.